Today I want to talk to you about some more things related to rhetorical analysis. One of the first things that you should know is that there are a number of things that you should look for in rhetorical analysis when you're analyzing a piece, and one place to start is with the FIDs. The F in FID stands for figurative language, the I stands for imagery, the first D for details, then we have diction, and then syntax. Today we're going to take a look at the F. We're going to look at figurative language and how to spot, analyze, and write about figurative language when we're writing a rhetorical analysis essay. Let's take a look. Figurative language is actually a pretty huge umbrella term, but we're going to try and simplify here. We're going to talk about the most common types of figurative language that most of you can spot in anything that you read in texts. The most common ones, of course, are similes, metaphors, personification. Hyperbole is right up there as well. There are a whole bunch of other types of figurative language, but we're going to focus on some of these basic ones that you probably learned in elementary school. I'd like to do this by taking a look at Edgar Allan Poe's famous short story, The Telltale Heart, and a selection from that. As you probably recall, The Telltale Heart is a short story by American writer Edgar Allan Poe that was published in 1843, and it's basically about an unnamed narrator who is attempting to convince readers that he's sane, and while he is attempting to convince us of this, he's simultaneously describing a murder that he's committed. You may remember that the victim is an old man who has this vulture eye, as the narrator calls it, and it's making the narrator crazy, and he ends up killing this man. So we're going to focus in on this short selection here that, as you may recall, is written in first person, and it reads, I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when my thumbs slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in the bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting upon the bed listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no! It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor." Or, "It is merely a cricket, which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him, and enveloped the victim, and it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. So it's probably pretty obvious from reading this and from reading the whole Telltale Heart that Poe has created a pretty dark mood. The story is definitely dismal and violent and somewhat frightening, and the narrator here is definitely a menace. That's probably pretty obvious from reading this, but as a person who needs to do some rhetorical analysis, you have to show how Poe did that, how he created that effect, how he created a narrator who's menacing. And so one of the ways that you do that is by looking at some of the FIDs that he uses. One of them is, of course, figurative language. And if you take a look here at the bottom of this passage, you've got this sentence right here, which is a metaphor. He says, all in vain, because death in approaching him had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. Here he's personified death. And so this might be something that you would talk about in your rhetorical analysis as a way that Poe has attempted to create a menacing tone in his piece. Okay, let's take a look at how you might incorporate this into a piece of writing about this use of figurative language. So let's remember that you need to identify a technique, you need to provide an example of that technique, and then you need to spend a good deal of time on that analysis. And in the analysis, you ultimately need to explain how that example creates a particular effect on the audience. And you got to explain how you know that that's the case. So here, the first sentence is used to identify the technique. In this section, Poe includes figurative language to create the persona of a menacing figure. So we've identified the technique, which is figurative language, and we've connected it to the tone that the author is attempting to create in this passage. Okay. In the second sentence, we more specifically identify what type of figurative language we've got here. In this case, it's personification, and then provide an example. So here it's written specifically, Poe uses personification when he writes that, quote, death in approaching him had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. Okay, and now it's time for us to spend a good deal of time, 2 or 3 sentences at least, to analyze this piece, ultimately to explain why this example creates a particular effect that relates to the tone of menace. Okay, so that's what we've got here. Here, the author, Poe, compares death to a man in order to intensify the old man's peril. In doing so, Poe suggests to his audience that death has the ability to sneak up on a person just as the narrator is doing to the old man. Death is no longer an abstract concept. It is a concrete and imposing figure that can walk into a room on an unsuspecting man. Okay. So here, the writer has used analysis-style words like suggests, has talked about this particular example specifically, hasn't just said that the author is doing this to try to create a picture in the audience's mind. That's not very good analysis. Here, the writer of this piece has specifically talked about this example that they've chosen and why this creates this menacing tone, why the audience feels the way that they do. And they do because he has personified death. It makes it far scarier to be scared of something that's walking right up that you can see coming at you, as opposed to some abstract concept the way we normally think about death. Okay, I hope that helps. Hope that's something you can apply to your own writing when talking about figurative language in your rhetorical analysis pieces. Good luck.